Howdy, folks. This is Dan Gross, and welcome to Extended Harmony for Outside In Music. Outside In Music is a record label and a jazz media company that connects artists with their passionate fan bases. Please visit our website, outsideinmusic.com, where you can see our artists, their recent releases, our podcast, video interviews, and links to get in touch with us. This podcast you're listening to, Extended Harmony, is produced monthly that features musicians in the jazz, blues, and soul umbrella who create original music. We discuss their lives, influences, their creative process, and some advice they'd like to pass along. Joining us today is bassist, composer, arranger, bandleader, and educator Joe Policastro. Originally from Ohio, he has spent time performing in Europe and settled in Chicago in early 2003, where he still is today. He's an in-demand bassist for vocalists, combos, and big bands alike, and today we're going to talk to him about himself, his trio, and his latest album, Screen Sounds, and anything else that comes up along the way. Thanks for tuning in, and please enjoy this episode of Extended Harmony. Joe, thanks for joining me today, man.
Oh, thanks for having me. This is great.
Let's start by talking about your early musical life. You are a Cincinnati native, yes?
That is correct.
So tell us a little bit about your... Yeah, go ahead.
No, I was born and raised in Cincinnati. I didn't come from a musical background, though. No one in my family played music, and at that time, where I lived in Cincinnati in the school systems, there were no, there really wasn't any music education. There was no school band or anything like that. So I kind of got into, my love for music kind of came through, just whatever people, like my friends were listening to, what I saw on TV, of course MTV and things like that were big at that time. So that was kind of how I got into music.
So you had no school band?
No, I went to a real small parochial school. It's like in the Catholic side of Cincinnati and stuff, right. And there was no school band, nothing like that.
So how did you? Obviously you've had academic training though. So did you start that when you were younger? Just kind of going to a local place that taught lessons?
That was all much later. I took piano lessons when I was really, really young, and it didn't really stick. And then, I was mainly interested in just, like rock bands and things like that. And I got interested in the electric bass when I was pretty young. But even that was just like, playing around on my own or, learning things off of the radio and just playing with friends and such.
Yeah, so when did you start? We'll come back to your influences, and because I know you mentioned TV, and this is kind of where there's some of your more recent music comes from. But when exactly did the academic music start? This isn't a typical jazz musician story. A lot of these guys come from really musical families and they get training young, but it sounds like you were a bit of a late bloomer.
Well, I think there's a good side and a bad side to this, and I was by the time I was probably about 12 or 13, I was really interested in lots of different music. I just didn't have a lot of access to it. So for me, it was always like I would hear something, and then I would try to find out where that was coming from, and that would lead me down another rabbit hole. But what kind of broke for me is there was this one time I was just hanging out in a music store, and this R&B bass player, this older guy, heard me, and he was like, "You don't know anything about the electric bass." And he was just like, and we were talking and stuff, and he kind of took me over to his place, and he was showing me. It was honestly the first time somebody identified like jazz music and R&B for me, where I had a clear understanding of this. So he was turning me on to like Jocko and James Jamerson, and and honestly, it was like the first time I really saw like a jazz clip. He showed me an Oscar Peterson trio video that he had, and I just like that kind of blew my mind seeing Ray Brown on the upright bass, and that was really where it started. So then I managed to get an upright bass, and at that point I would just ask around, like, well, who do I study with? What do I do? And I managed to hook up with a guy from the Cincinnati Symphony Orchestra.
Wow.
And I got really serious really fast on the instrument. And that was really where it started. I joined Youth Symphony Orchestra at that point, and at that point I started to kind of find the network of jazz musicians in the city, and Cincinnati was great at that time because, you know, there were all these older musicians that would really take you under their wing and put you in their bands, and like you really learned on the job. I mean, I was getting gigs with phenomenal musicians in Cincinnati well before I should have been.
Right.
I mean, they were very gracious that way.
And where did you go to college, Joe?
At first, I went to Miami University in Ohio, just because that guy that I was studying with from the Cincinnati Symphony Orchestra taught there, and I wanted to keep studying classical double bass for a little while longer. And then I just really knew I didn't want to head that direction, you know, professionally. I mean, it was fabulous music, and I mean, it was such great training and stuff. So I dropped out, and then I eventually rejoined the conservatory in Cincinnati and did my undergrad there, and then later in life got a master's degree at DePaul University.
And when did you...
In Chicago.
So that's when you made the move to Chicago?
No, I had actually already moved here. I'd been here for probably close to a decade before I did a master's degree later in life just to have it. So
of course, well, it's a good goal to accomplish. You know, I know I would like to do that at some point. You've actually, something you said earlier was actually a great lead-in to something I wanted to ask you about. One thing that really impressed me about your playing is obviously your interpretation of the music, but I, as a bass player myself, I'm watching you play, and you have exceptional technique on both pizzicato and arco. And hearing you talk about your background, I'm learning, he started off on the electric bass, and he played classical bass. So and for you, how did you develop this technique? How did you grow it? Did it ever at any point you say, man, I'm really starting to learn here? I mean, you mentioned getting serious, but I am just curious about the process of developing your technique.
Well, so the guy that I studied with, his name's Rick Visicero, and he was one of the International Society of Bassists, like solo competition winners. And I mean, Rick was I'm trying to remember sort of like his background in particular. Like he studied with Eugene Levinson, and I mean, just this great history of classical double basses, and he was kind of a diehard of the Raboth method. And at that time, there were kind of new method books popping up from like Hal Robinson and that. And I mean, when I got to Rick, I have to be honest, I couldn't read music.
Yeah.
In fact, my very first experience in like Youth Symphony Orchestra, you know, I worked really hard on the music, and I was able to, you know, like got principal, and I remember going in there, and we're like the first symphony they throw on the stand. It's like we're looking at Tchaik 5, and I'm just watching notes go by. It was horrifying. You know?
I literally can't imagine.
It was awful. I mean, but that kind of stuff it was the motivation. It was like, all right, I have got to get my sight reading together. So it was like these were good motivators, and I think what I was saying, the good and the bad side of that is, one, I don't take anything for granted. And I mean, so things that I wanted to learn, I really wanted to learn. And then two, having that kind of grassroots background, you know, where you're struggling to figure out things. Where I remember the first time I tried to understand a walking bass line, I literally wrote out every single note, and I was just looking at it, not even understanding what they were, and I'm thinking, like, how does this bass player memorize this bass line? This is incredible, you know. And then people are like, you know, you moron, this is a walking bass, and he's playing over the chord. And he's like, and it's like, oh, this makes so much more sense. But having to go there, that's just struggle that way to try to piece all these things together.
Yeah. And, well, you know, it's funny hearing you talk. I was a lot in the same. I mean, I learned how to read music, but it's nice hearing someone else who appreciates that. Oh no, you actually got to work pretty hard at something. So let's talk about your move to Chicago for a little while here. I mean, you mentioned you had moved out there and you were trying to seek work. In those early days in Chicago, what was Joe Policastro's life as a bassist like then?
Well, so Cincinnati, you know, because I did come up through that, what I call like an apprenticeship system, you know, my background was really in, jazz and standards, and there was a good like traditional jazz scene there, so I got to play with a lot of Dixieland bands. But a lot of what I was doing was, I started accompanying a lot of vocalists in Cincinnati. So when I first moved to Chicago, one of the ways that I got employed almost 7 nights a week right off the bat was when people knew that you knew these songs and that you could transpose. And I mean, that's such, I mean, even at that time when I think the music, I mean, this was, in the very early 2000s. I mean, that Young Lion thing was still going on. A lot of the jazz groups, even the more quote unquote progressive ones, were still kind of focused on, bebop and standards and everything. Not that that's not prevalent now, but I mean, it was really the music du jour of that time. So, I mean, when people knew that they could trust somebody that way, it was easy to get work. And to be honest, that was kind of the bulk of what I did for, most of my time in Chicago. I would say up until I kind of started focusing more like on this trio of mine and some other side projects. I mean, I still obviously, anybody works as a sideman and accompanies other people and plays in projects, but I mean, back then it was just, so much of my work was just accompanying vocalists and playing in some, instrumental trios and things.
How did you learn from your time being a struggling sideman, and what are some things that you learned then that you apply now?
Well, I think one thing about being a sideman that you can take for granted is like what leaders have to do, and I think that's, it's really easy to answer the phone and just go and expect everything to be great and, to have nice gigs and have accommodations and, and that's easy to take for granted. And I think sometimes when you're, if you're able to work for a successful artist, it's a good idea to sometimes take stock of all the things that they have to do extra musically to make sure that their things are functioning. So I think really good accomplished performers, sometimes you can, there's obviously music is of the utmost importance, but it's interesting to see people who know how to lead a group, who know how to talk to an audience, who know how to structure a night, who know how to program music, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, and you have learned that very well, I know, over the years. And I want to start unpacking something a little bit. You mentioned your early days in Chicago. You were focusing on these different things, but all of a sudden you started to become a leader of your own trio, and you've had this permanent residency gig for a while. Yes, is that how this music developed? You got this residency gig and you just invited guys in? I mean, how did the band form, and how did the residency you have fit in?
So about almost 9 years ago now.
Wow.
There's a club called Pops for Champagne. It used to be a 7-night-a-week jazz club. It actually was at a different location, and then about 11 years ago it moved to this new location, and they had a downstairs jazz club and then kept another part of the club upstairs. So they had the full-time jazz club downstairs, but they decided to add music upstairs. And it was originally just this like background music gig. It was a guitar and bass duo, and it wasn't even under my name. I was a sideman on it. It was a guitarist I worked with a lot.
Yeah.
And that eventually developed into a trio, again, still under this other guitar player's name. And at that time, just because we were playing together, it was started off as one night, it eventually became 3. And then, I started arranging for the group a lot, because I've always done a lot of arranging, even for other ensembles that I was a part of, from big bands all the way down to, just small group jazz of any size, number of horns,
Right.
But it was really fun to start arranging for the trio, and we that group eventually was doing all this like West Side Story material, and the original group is actually the very first record I put out under my name of that West Side Story stuff is the result of that band. But that group, that guitar player, actually, he was a great guitar player, Dan Eflin. He was kind of dropping out of music and just wanted to pursue something else. He's just one of those guys that just, got fed up with it and, loved music and played great, but just wanted to go a different direction.
Yeah.
So I took over the trio at Pops, and then I had to get a new guitar player, and also the drummer, the original drummer of that group, left, and that's when our current drummer, Michael Avery, came on. Mm-hmm. And there were some different guitar players that kind of floated in, and guys who played great. But I was really, I had a particular direction that I wanted to start kind of moving the music in, just on a different arranging that I was doing. Dave, who's originally from Chicago, had moved back to town from New York, and I brought him in one night, and it was just such a great fit. And at that point, which that was about 3 years ago, I would say really that's when I started to really focus on the band as you know, as an entity that I was pushing outside of Chicago, and you know, putting out more releases and such. So
yeah, and so I think this is actually this is a bit of an interesting origin story, and it's not a typical one that you sort of appropriate is too strong a word, but it's interesting that you were playing with this guy, and you liked the rep he was playing, and you found your own take on it. This wasn't a sort of divine spark moment. I mean, it kind of mimicked your life path in a way. It wasn't just like everything was dropped in front of you. I mean, you had to rock what you got, and you had to figure out something. And can you tell us a little bit about sort of the early time when you realized, like, oh, hey, I can actually get a band together and I can put together my own rep? That's got to be kind of a scary thing for someone who hadn't been a band leader before.
Well, I had, interestingly, I had led bands before, but nothing that I thought I was going to try to like push beyond Chicago. So there was a group that I would always been really interested. I love Ornette. I love Jimmy Giuffre. I love Jerry Mulligan. Jerry Mulligan was one of my earliest influences, and I had this group that did I transcribed all of the Mulligan quartet material, and then wrote an entire book of original material for that group as well, and it was called Giroux, and it was really active from the time I moved to Chicago until it's actually now kind of up and running again. It took a long hiatus.
Oh, cool!
But I had led that group, and so I definitely was focusing on side projects, but nothing where I was going to take up the majority of my days, Right. And so when when the trio really started hitting all these particular notes, and where I really felt that the thing about like the Mulligan project, it's like it's still as much fun as it is to play that music, and I think it's really important to keep certain styles alive. You definitely still feel like that's somebody else's music and thing, even if you're contributing original music to it.
Right.
This was the first project under my name where I honestly felt like I don't think anything sounds like this. I think the collective aspect of the way the group functions together, it just felt special to me, and that was really the moment where I was like, yes, the band is under my name as the leader, but it doesn't function that way, and it doesn't feel like that musically. But it's nice, I think, in some ways, to have a band that has a person at the front of it, so that it's just clear in terms of when somebody does have to make choices about what we're going to do or where we're going to travel and things. It can make it easier. But honestly, that was it for me. It was just when hearing the original music that we do, and then these sort of drastic reworkings of other material that we do. Not that of course hasn't been done, but I really feel like there's no other group right now that kind of takes the same approach that we do.
Well, it's hard to argue with that, and that's one of the reasons I wanted to have you on. So can you kind of tell us what your approach is? I mean, you mentioned you do original compositions, you do really amazing and interesting takes on the theme from The Godfather or West Side Story. What's sort of the process from deciding, okay, here's the source material I want to work with, to where it ends up being?
So, and this is the luxury of having a steady gig 3 nights a week. So we get to do. I can pick anything I want. So it's like right now I just started. We just started doing a whole bunch of new music. I wrote a bunch of new tunes, and then like I just had always wanted to play Goldfinger. Right. So it's like something like that. It's like I'll start working on it. I'll bring it to the guys. I'll have a clear. Usually I don't want to just play a tune, so I usually try to have something in mind but I like to, we talk about pops as the factory, where it's like we go ahead and we bring it in, we kind of bounce it around a little bit, we kind of talk, play through, then we start sort of turning it on its head, and maybe at that point something in that process will click where we begin to say, like, this is the direction we're going to go with this, or that's how we're going to, now reimagine this. Because the one thing that I absolutely insist on with taking this other material is that I want anybody I don't want people to not be able to recognize the material, because that kind of jazz approach of just like, oh, I took a Stevie Wonder song and I stuck a bunch of dumb jazz chords to it, and then I've got no interest in that, and so if you're going to do the Stevie Wonder song, it's like, I want to know about the DNA of that song and what makes it work, and then try to turn that inside out, so that any casual listener can be like, wow, that's creeping, or, but then where the direction that it takes, the people, I have to say that's the one comment that we get over and over again. The thing I'm most proud of is that people always say, this is so cool, I love that song, but I would have never imagined it in this way, or you guys, all the voices are present, it's such a democratic group, and that kind of stuff, so...
And that was a great lead into my next couple questions. We'll start with this one. You mentioned having the luxury was the word you used, of having a permanent gig, of having a residency, and more musicians don't have this. And I'm curious about your thoughts as to why you think this is important, and if it's what you believe that there should be more. Why do you think there should be more?
Well, I'll tell you just so I like to think of myself as a listener first. All of us that play music and all of us involved in music, I would hope that all of us are listeners first because we love music. Yeah. And I know as a listener that, obviously there's some forms of music where bands have to have music up on stage. Right. But there's nothing that gets me less excited than to go see a group of people staring at music on a music stand, trying to work through a bunch of difficult arrangements that they play together once every 6 months. Right. Now, that, of course, is a reality in this music, and there are so many unbelievably talented musicians that are just crack players that can that pull this off very, very well. It still is not the same thing as seeing a band that functions together, that actually plays together, that has logged hours. Right. And there's no replacement for time and chemistry. I don't care how well you play together. The more time you spend with those people together, the deeper the connection will be. And you can, when you see a true band that plays together, and you watch that freedom of them interacting and the way that they play over the music. That to me is what you're trying to get to. I always draw the parallel, in jazz it's so acceptable to have 4 people that barely ever play together and never rehearse and go play a gig. Right. And what other world would you ever think that that's acceptable? What rock and roll band would you be like, I don't know. We brought our music along and we're gonna just kind of see what happens. We're gonna end songs badly and talk a lot in between tunes and. Yeah.
Well, it's I definitely wanted to talk with you about that because last episode of this podcast, I had Tom Christensen on from Spin Cycle, and he said a lot of the same things, and it's like a sports team too. You got to have chemistry, but you got to spend time together too. Leading into the next thing I wanted to ask you about, the 2 guys you play with, Dave Miller and Michael Avery, both are very not only talented but unique musicians in their own right. And Michael in particular, he plays this kooky drum kit with this modified bass drum that was a double bass drum. He uses a rubber joke sunny side up egg as a snare mute. And what are the things that these 2 guys specifically bring to this group that no one else can?
So both of these guys have absolutely unique voices. There's so that in and of itself is something that you just can't manufacture. It's like people who have very personal voices. Like Dave touches the guitar, you're like, that's Dave Miller. Michael plays the drums, and just the things that he does and the sounds that he gets and his palette and his approach, you're like, that's Michael Avery.
Right.
So that's cool, but then that has to work together in the stew. You know, it's like you can't have one spice stick out. You know, and that I think is the thing about having the three of us together are these three very individual voices, and all of us have. You know, if you think of a bunch of circles, I mean, we have parts where we overlap quite a bit, which is why I think we work together. But then each person has things that are unrelated to the other, and it's that mixture of what we have in common versus what, you know, the uniqueness of us. I think that gives the group its sound.
Yeah, it's a very good looking.
The creative energy of all those guys.
Yeah,
exactly. That's exactly what I was trying to say.
Yeah. Well, we only have a handful more questions for you. Excuse me. Before we talk about the new album, Screen Sounds, can you tell us a little bit about the albums you did previously? You talked a little bit about Giroux, which was your first one as a leader, and then West Side Story Suite and Pops. Can you tell us about those ones before we go into Screen Sounds?
Yeah. So West Side Story Suite is pretty self-explanatory. It was a suite for jazz trio of the music of West Side Story. But no, it was really, that album was tons of fun to work on. And again, it wasn't this like thing I was like, I have to write a suite of West Side Story. It was just, we were playing the music, people were responding to it really well, and it was fun to then take this extremely challenging music with odd forms and strange melodies and try to honor the material, but then how to make it as like, you know, jazz vehicles and stuff. Right. So, and that material in the hands of the current band is really taken on another life. I almost wish, I love the guy, the original iteration of the trio, but man, I wish I could almost re-record the thing now.
Yeah.
And then Pops was an homage to Pops for Champagne, and, you know, as we were kind of transitioning into other material, we had, the group does so much music from, you know, the 60s up to the current day, reworking that material. So we thought it'd be just a fun album to record all these jazz arrangements of pop tunes and then pay homage to Pops. And I had a couple of guests on that record, guitar players that had been a part of sort of the history of that venue.
Cool.
So that was a fun album to do that way as well.
Yeah, and can you tell us about Screen Sounds, your latest album?
So this album was really fun, and it's very personal to me. It was something I kind of led with at the beginning. It's all movie and TV music, and all of us are, you know, in the band, we're all big film and TV buffs. But for me specifically, I mean, that was my sort of gateway to discovering so much music, from MTV to David Letterman to CBS Sunday Morning, you know, just whatever it was, movie scores. So we just, and again, it took shape sort of by accident. I often bring in a lot of movie things and such, and then we started looking at it and we're like, man, that'd be a really fun album to put together, you know, grab some movie scores and rework them, maybe some songs that were featured in movies, and that's how it came about.
Well, too cool. It's a great album. We'll put up a link for it for people can watch it. And before I ask you what track you want us to play, I like to end all my interviews with this question. I feel it's an important one, and you work as an educator, so I think you'll be prepared for this. Do you have any advice for aspiring artists?
Boy, that is a very good question, and a loaded one at that.
Yes, a little bit.
One of the things I always say to students is I will never use the word should. I don't think anyone should do anything. There are things that I think people will need to do if they want to accomplish certain things, and so obviously of the utmost importance is you have to follow your own path. You need to be true to yourself. You have to, you need to believe in the things that you like and the artists that you like, and developing your voice and your instrument that way. That being said, there are sandbox skills that you're going to need to learn along the way. It doesn't mean you're going to need to learn to be a crack reader, but if you don't learn to read music, there are going to be opportunities that you're not going to be able to take advantage of.
Right.
You don't have to be able to play your instrument from A to Z, but limiting your technique is going to limit certain possibilities of expression. That doesn't mean you're not going to be able to express yourself. I would never say that under any stretch of the imagination.
Right.
But so I think you also can't close yourself off from influences or sounds just because they didn't come to you naturally and such. That doesn't mean you have to take things that come to you as well. So I would just say being open-minded, taking stock of everything you hear, all the people around you, listening to your peers, but also listening to your quote unquote elders, your teachers and such, and musicians that have come before you, and filter all those things through your own passions and stuff, and then make your choices accordingly.
Thank you so much for your time, Joe. Really appreciate it. Is there any tune, any track you'd like us to play off of Screen Sounds to wrap up this podcast?
Well, I was thinking about that. I think the opening track, Yojimbo, the main title theme, is particularly interesting because it's one I think that demonstrates the real wide sonic palette of the group, and then it being a movie score that was written for a big band with mixed Japanese instruments, asking a jazz trio of guitar, bass, and drums to try to pull that off is kind of a big feat, and if it was a fun one at that. Yeah. And I really think it kind of showcases the broad palette of the group. It's just all the percussion things that Mike gets into with it. There's arco parts in there. Dave's got all these effects on the guitar, all of which are created naturally. There's no pedals on any of that stuff. That's all amp manipulation and stuff. So
okay. Well, we look forward to checking that out. Joe, thanks so much for your time today, man.
Oh, thank you.